Okay, guys, I want to apologize, or just my disclaimer is I know that many of you have been to the talk last weekend, and there's a couple of people who asked me to just record what we've discussed, so I'm going to try my best to remember what I've said, but I have 3 points to make, and I can still remember that, so thank you very much for enduring this again. And for those who listen to the video, thank you very much that you are that you tap into the channel and share this if you like. What I'm not going to do tonight, I'm not going to speak about the Shabbat in terms of what we used to, the breaking of the bread, the pouring of the wine, the blessings, the lighting of the candles, the blessings prayed over the children, the giving of flowers, and there are more signs. What I want to say tonight about the Shabbat is we very often neglect to speak about the why. We very often in Shabbat speak about the what and the how. And we should never forget and never stop to do that, because I think the what and the how helps us to remember the Shabbat as God commands us. He tells us, remember and keep the Shabbat. And both of those terms in Hebrew, the one remember is the verb zakar, which means to do the actions that helps you to keep this thing alive. In other words, if we stop breaking bread, if we stop gathering, if we stop having family meals together, that is when the Shabbat fizzles out of our lives. So I'm not going to talk about that. And also one very important word that I just want to make mention of is the Bible speaks about keeping the Shabbat. And the word keeping, like the word law, and I'll speak about that now, has got a negative connotation, for it feels like we need to kind of protect something, but not in a positive way. Because we associate that with keeping the law, and I'll speak about the law in a moment. So the Bible says we should keep remember, in other words, do the things that won't make it fade out of our lives, but also to keep it. In other words, put a hedge of protection. The Hebrew word shamar means literally to protect. As a shepherd would put thorns around a camp to protect the sheep, in the same way, God commands us to put a hedge of protection. In other words, let nothing takes its place. And that is the beauty of us being together here tonight. Just to have a meal together, to break bread together, to remind ourselves that this week has got a full stop behind it. There is a place where this week and all its toil and all its effort stops. And I think that's the beauty of Shabbat. And we should never stop doing that. But that's not what I want to that's not what I want to talk about tonight. I want to make mention of 3 things that I believe helps us to grapple with that why of Shabbat. And I'm going to first put it out and then we'll discuss it. First point is the Shabbat is a gift. The second point is the Shabbat is a sign. And the third point is the Shabbat is an invitation to order. And let me quickly explain. Let's talk about gift. In Hebrew, when they do the prayers at Shabbat, they call it the bracha. It's the Hebrew word for blessing and the Hebrew word for gift has the same root word, and it literally means to go on your knee to present a gift to somebody that you honor. So when we say in Hebrew, Baruch atah, Yahweh Eloheinu melech haolam, we say, Yahweh, I go onto my knee and I present to you the gift of honoring you, that you made this day different. But also in the same way, God gives us the gift. And I'll talk about that now. So for a moment, I'm going to ask you to hold the tension where I'm going to place the idea of a gift and the idea of law opposed to each other, or juxtaposed to each other. And it'll make sense in a moment, hopefully. For most people, when they think about the Shabbat, they think about do's and don'ts. In other words, they think of it in terms of rules, in terms of law. And our very good friend Rudy here is an advocate. He understands the law has got a much more complex and a much more intricate way of interacting with normal life. But for most Westerners, my experience is that the idea of law is a negative connotation. An example would be, I need to chase to town and I've got little time at hand, or I start off late. And what happens is now I want to go at 120 or 140 an hour. A road sign tells me I can only go at 80 k's an hour. What do? I'm frustrated because something in me wants to go at 120. And who dares tell me what speed I can go at? Because that kind of imposes a limitation on my freedom. And we don't like somebody to tell us what to do, because I think it's a matter of, as we grow older, and especially in our culture, we don't enjoy control. I don't enjoy somebody telling me what to do. We have a problem with control. But you know what, interestingly, this is a problem in our culture. In Eastern culture, near ancient Eastern culture, the understanding of God telling his people what to do, they understood that there was always this conundrum. I wanted to, plant and expect a harvest and do all sorts of things, but I never knew which way or what I should do to appease the gods, the strong ones, the mighty ones. And here comes Yahweh and he tells you, do this and do that and you shall live. Okay, so there's that idea of law, which in ancient or near ancient Middle Eastern culture, which wasn't that negative. But for us, somehow we think of law as a set of limiting, help me with the words, it opposes our liberty, it opposes our freedom. And we don't like that. We don't like somebody to tell us what to do. But let's say for a moment, I drive my little courier truck at 120. My courier truck is 2 meters 40 high, and a sign by the roadside says there's a bridge ahead that's 2 meters 20. What would be my rightful response towards that sign? Would it be that I say, no one tells me I can't do this? And I say, to hell with the sign, I just go for it. What would be the consequence? I would lose my life. I would be killed. I would be dead. But let's say I could see that sign for what it is. It puts out a warning, this could save your life. This could be a protection. Okay? So this is the conundrum with rules and law. We very often tend to think of rules and law from a negative perspective because we don't want it to impose on our liberty, impose on our freedom. I mean, even the institutional church has made this thing into a creation or a version of Messiah where they said Jesus literally rescues us from a God who puts us under rules, and that whole conundrum. But let's say, and there's many of you here tonight who have children and you kids, this will one day make a lot of sense to you. Let's say your mom and your dad tells you not to touch the hot plate, okay? And you're young, you don't understand it because you don't understand why that hot thing burns you and why why that happens. You don't understand it necessarily. But you obey them and they tell you if you're going to touch it, we're going to smack your hand. Okay, whatever the case may be. But when you grow old, can you now touch the hot plate? No. The hot plate remains a problem. But because you've obeyed them, because you've listened to the no's, to the do's and the don'ts when you were little, that liberates you when you're older. So that very thing which started off as a do and a don't ends up being the very thing that turns into a gift. So this is the first point. The Shabbat, the children of Israel, when they come out of Egypt and they arrive at Mount Sinai and Moses comes down and he tells them about the Shabbat, for them, they've never had anything that made the week stop. Nothing. They literally worked for 7 days, 7 nights, round the clock. I don't know if that's the way it worked, but they never stopped. They didn't even know when the week started and when it ended. But we have the freedom and the beauty of God saying, I'm holding out to you a gift. You're allowed, you're invited to stop. Okay, so the Shabbat is a gift. Think of this, and this is the last example I want to use. If I hold out to you and say, or I hold out my hand and say, hey, here's a meal, a nourishing, healthy meal with a glass of wine and dessert, and you're welcome to sit at the table and you have no stress. You can eat like a king, versus here's McDonald's. You know what we very often do with the Shabbat? God holds out the 5-star meal and we slap his hand and say, thank you, I'll take the McDonald's. And this to me very often is the sadness about the Shabbat. And it takes us a lifetime, very often, to discover that which starts off as a do and a don't, that which starts off as a law, turns out to be a gift. So the first point I want to make is the Shabbat is a gift. The second point, the Shabbat is a sign. And I'm going to read to you 2 verses from Exodus 31, and I'm reading in the English. The context to this piece is, this is the very last words exchanged between Yahweh and Moses just before he comes down and finds the whole camp of Israel worshipping golden calves. Okay, so verse 12 of Exodus 31 says, "And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, And you speak to the children of Israel, saying, My Sabbaths are to guard." And this is the word shamar. In other words, you need to protect it by all means. "For it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations." This is hectic. "To know that I am Yahweh, setting you apart." There's so much going on here. God tells Moses, tell the children of Israel, you need to protect, you need to put a hedge of protection around the Sabbath. For the Sabbath is a sign between you and me forever in all your generations. For this thing reminds you that you are different. You are different than the rest. You are called out of the masses. Okay? And it goes on, and God repeats himself, and at the end, this is fascinating. Verse 17 says, "Between me and the children of Israel as a sign forever. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth. And on the seventh day," now listen to this, "he rested." God rested. And then the verb, he refreshed. That verb in Hebrew is the word nafash. If you go look at what it means, it literally means that God breathed on himself again. It's literally as if God went, and God became almost metaphorically a living being again. And something in me goes, how if God does that? Who are we to say we don't need that, or to whatever with this? And then he goes on to say, okay, so this is why the Sabbath is important, because I, as Yahweh, decide that I stop. This is, by the way, the meaning of the word Shabbat means to stop. God says, and on that day I rest, very important, but also I refresh, I breathe on myself again to become a living being again. And just a side note, all the gods of Egypt were inanimate beings. They were wooden objects. They were objects fashioned out of gold and silver and all sorts of things. But God in himself, if you look at the word Yahweh, it literally is a verb meaning I am air. I contain air. And the last thing is, God says in Genesis 2, when he makes man and woman, he says, I make them in my image and in my likeness. So when it's just a sign, he literally tells them, the rest of the world will look at you. There will be one thing that will set you apart. There'll be one thing that will make you stand out from the rest, and that is that you rest, because I'm resting. It's a sign. And on this point, the Hebrew word Shabbat consists out of 3 Hebrew letters, a shin, a beit, and a tav. Those are the names of the letters. And the pictures are teeth, and a tent, and a cross. The cross, not the Christian cross, but the cross meaning if I shoot a target, if I aim my crossbow at a target, that little cross where I'm focusing my visor, that is the target, the mark. Also signifies a covenant in Hebrew. So God says, the teeth, that which represents cutting off or separating, God says, I separate the household of the covenant by the Shabbat. This is the sign. Cutting you free from the nations who's just out there. They have no idea. And then the last point, the Shabbat is an invitation to order. Now, very short. Who's heard of the 10 Commandments? All of us. We grew up with it. Okay? Do you know that the word 10 Commandments are nowhere to be found in the Bible? Nowhere. The Hebrew word is aseret hadevarim, and it literally means the 10 important words. The word in Hebrew, devar, is a word and it is a matter. So it says the 10 important matter, but also the 10 important things, the 10 important words. And then if you look at the word devar, it has a root word, a parent root called dar, a dalet and a resh in Hebrew, or the way we would speak is just D-A-R. And that word literally means order, as in going in a circle, in a fashion or an orderly fashion, pretty much like how you would conduct a dance if you would be with somebody. Okay? So this quote unquote 10 commandments really are 10 important matters to God. But more so, these matters contains an order. So God says not only are these 10 points But the sequence are important, the order in which they happen. So what happens in the beginning of the 10 Commandments, the 10 important things? God speaks about himself. He says, you have to have no one else before me. First point. Secondly, you don't make a casting of me. You don't make an example of me by fashioning it into a object that represents me. Nothing. I don't like that. By the way, if you think of the golden calf, God just told Moses, don't make a representation, don't make a copy of me, because you will fail at that. Because I am not limited by anything you will create. And then God says, thirdly, don't bring my name to naught. We often have that as don't use the name of God in vain. But actually in Hebrew it means don't misrepresent who I am. So if you look at your own life, am I representing Yahweh? This is the point. So the first three important matters, orderly matters, it's got to do with God. And then from number 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it's all got to do with possessions and other relationships. Okay, and God says, don't covet your neighbor's wife, don't covet his donkey, and it goes on. And it pertains to things or relations other than God. But what is the bridge between the first three and the last 5 or the last 6? Is the fourth one, where it says, you shall keep my Sabbath. And here's a curious thing about 4 in Hebrew. It's the letter Dalet, and it always means a tent door or a port of entrance. And all throughout the text, if you look at the representation of Jesus, of the Messiah, it is always the number 4. And now you go to John 10, and Jesus says, I am the door, I am the gate. And the sages have said, it's first God. Don't put anything before me. Don't misrepresent me. Don't make a casting of me. And then there's, at the end, all the relations, all the things. But in the middle, there's the Shabbat, which says the Shabbat is an invitation to place the correct emphasis, the correct value on everything else, on my friends, on my spouse, on all my relationships other than God, on all my things that is in my life. And this invitation to come into the rest of God is almost the reprogramming. So once I acknowledge that God's economy is not one of labor and striving and exhaustion and overproductivity, I think God endorses that we enjoy our work and that we do our thing. But God is all about placing rest first. And this is the invitation. The Shabbat invites us into God's rest so that everything else makes sense. The Shabbat is a gift. The Shabbat is a sign, and the Shabbat is an invitation to reorder and to reprioritize everything. May we all discover the beauty of God's rest and God's Shabbat. Enjoy the evening. Cheers.